Welcome, everybody, to our first online session. This is our 2022 SKAY educational series. It's a joint effort between Morehead State University and UK faculty members, as well as some of our yak producers in the region. And we wanted to provide some opportunities for you all to uh, hear some things that we have going on, have the opportunity to maybe listen to some of our uh, kind of tales from the B side, if you will, and how some of the things that we do on the B side may help the yak industry move forward, and also share some of our ongoing research in future sessions. But we'll try to make these kind of informal. So if you've got questions, feel free to type those in the chat box as we go forward. What is SKAY? SKAY is really just an abbreviation that we came up with. It's a scientific knowledge advancement for yak husbandry. It's basically yak spelled backwards. That was kind of a quick one that came to mind for us, but the intent really is a focus group to try and assist our yak breeders and owners by providing some science and experience-based educational materials. There's not very much out there in North America on published materials, so as we have the opportunity to go through some of the peer-reviewed literature, we'll develop some of those, as well as outcomes of kind of new research that might be done here in the States. We'll also work with our industry partners and producers to try and seek grant funding opportunities to support applied research with Yaks, to try and advance that knowledge base. And then also one of the outcomes is really to try and cultivate an exchange between university faculty and yak breeders and owners like yourselves to aid in advancing yak husbandry in North America, and maybe think about what traits are of importance as folks begin thinking about their breeding programs. And if we were to move towards, for example, breeding values or EPDs, what some of those traits of interest would be from the industry out there. We have another session that's scheduled for March the 8th. It'll be an introduction to judging terminology. I know a lot of you just got back from the Northwestern, and it was kind of my first time tuning in to the Yak show, but I noticed they had a beef cattle judge there and was using a lot of the terminology that we would use on judging. Both Dr. Bullock and I were judges in our collegiate careers, but sometimes we may use terminology that's maybe unfamiliar because it's coming in from the B side. So Zach's going to share with you all a little bit on judging terminology. The session will be a little different. You'll need to register. And so once you register, then you will get the link and the password for that next session. And we'll probably do that moving forward just to give us a little bit of safety, but also allow us to help kind of get an idea who all is joining in on the programs. As far as the sessions go, because there will be time that's needed to get that registration in, be sure to not wait till the last minute. Try to jump on there and get registered no later than noon the day of the webinar, and that'll give the system enough time to get you that link out. And so with that, I'm just going to kind of share my contact information down there. Again, I'm Jeff Lempcooler. I'm one of the beef cattle extension specialists here that's been working with Greg and doing some on-farm research, looking at winter performance of weaned yaks at his place. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And again, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's program. Tonight, we're joined by my colleague, Dr. Bullock. Dare's a extension beef cattle specialist here at the University of Kentucky, and well-trained in more of the population genetics aspects, and has worked many years in the beef side and has a lot of experience working in the beef side and some of the growing challenges and pains, if you will, that some associations maybe have gone through as they've moved into the breeding programs, and has a lot of involvement in the Beef Improvement Federation. He's also worked with many of his colleagues on developing some tools to help look at some indexes that are out there. We, for example, under Dr. Bullock's guidance, had a bull program, and he worked with his colleagues to try and take some of that information to come up with, all right, how can you value these bulls when you go to a bull sale and try to maximize your return on your investment. So with that, Dr. Bullock, I'm going to turn the program over to you. And just a quick reminder, if you've got questions, go ahead and type those in the chat, or otherwise we'll acknowledge you at the end if you've got questions, and just use the kind of one of the icons, reaction icons or something, or raise your hand like this, and we'll be sure to acknowledge you and get those questions answered. Dr. Bullock, take it away.
I appreciate it, Jeff. So I'm curious now, buddy, because I'm not seeing the record icon. Are you?
I am recording.
Okay. All right. So it's just not showing up on mine. I'm used to the one being the one recording, so I guess that's why it shows up then. Well, I appreciate it. It is a pleasure to speak to you guys tonight. As I told Jeff, this is outside of my box, but not the furthest outside that I have been in my career, because I did write an article one time for the Maine Coon Cat Association. So that was probably the furthest outside of my box I've been, but it's actually been kind of fun. Ted and Jeff and I have had some conversations, and I'd have to admit that I have learned a lot here in the past couple of weeks getting ready for this. So we'll kind of jump in, and I guess Jeff did a little survey just to kind of find out what folks that were producing yaks, kind of what their reasons were. And you guys are diverse, probably more diverse than the beef, but we actually see a lot of diversity in the beef side of things too, in terms of why people are in the industry. One aspect is certainly going to be the meat side of it for you guys. There's also the fiber aspect, so the wool, seed stock. And so some of you, and as the industry probably develops, we would see more differentiation here. Whereas now I would imagine that most of the seed stock guys are also heavily participating in the meat and fiber, or one and or the other of those. But sometimes when an industry gets big enough, you'll see a segmenting off of that seed stock part, and not so much producing for the end product as much as producing the animals that are going to be the genetic base. As with the beef industry, there are some folks that are doing this out of the pleasure that it gives them, and I can promise you that you're going to get no argument from me. If that's what your goals are, then that's certainly a viable reason, I think, to be in the business. And then the other category that was listed was kind of an accumulation of everything else. And I guess, Jeff, the one that you and I talked about, I guess there are some that are heavy into the milk side of it as well with the yaks. And so I guess that probably fell in that other category. If we're going to talk about genetics, and that's what I talk about, genetics are my wheelhouse, so that's where we're going to be. And whereas Ted is more on the molecular side of things and the genomics, mine is more on what we call the quantitative side of things. And so that's pulling things together and using a lot of the things that are developed by those smarter guys to kind of figure out how we can use them. And anytime we're going to try and make genetic change or think about the genetics, we need to think about breeding objectives. And breeding objectives are just the goals that influence what it is we're trying to do. So in anything that has a genetic component to it, okay? So if you have a goal that genetics plays a role in that trait or whatever, then those need to be how we think about setting up our breeding objectives. I always like to tell producers that a breeding objective should have an impact that's going to improve your quality of life. Now, for a lot of folks, that's going to be economics, and whether, regardless of which phase of the industry you're in, I would suspect that most people that are in the business, if nothing else, want to lose as little money as possible and hopefully make some money at some point in time with what they're trying to do. So economics for most people in the livestock industry as a whole look at an economic aspect of that. A lot of people want to make sure they have the nicest looking animals possible. And so I appeal might be a strong factor or a strong breeding objective for what you're trying to do, whether that's to improve your marketability or whether you just like nice looking animals out in your pastures. And then the social aspect of it. And that's one that we can't overlook, just the pure joy of being in the business. And we see that in the beef industry too. There's a lot of people that raise beef just because they enjoy it and they enjoy hanging around other beef people and so forth. So there are some social aspects that can help improve your quality of life as well. And there's aspects of your breeding program that might better pursue that. Just to give a couple of examples, and you're going to notice these are pretty close together, the two examples I'm going to give you, but because a lot of breeding objectives are going to be constant across most operations, and then we might see some deviation depending on some finer tuning of that. But I think most would agree that maintaining easy calving is going to be a goal. And in some of the conversations and things I've read, it doesn't seem like that's a problem for you guys, but you want to always keep it in mind that you don't want it to become a problem, because once you start pursuing more growth, there is the potential that it could result in the future of giving you some more calving problems. So it's something that I think you'll always want to keep in check. We want to make sure our animals aren't going to kill us when we're trying to work calves or when we're trying to, work around the cattle. It would be good that if we can try and keep them as controllable as possible, and that is partially controlled by genetics. It has a lot to do with how we handle them, but genetics is a factor, and so we can certainly make that one of our breeding objectives. I think most everybody would agree that we want to be as efficient as possible. And the best way to be efficient is through high pregnancy rates. And from the things that I have read, that's one area where I think you guys can really benefit from, is trying to get some improvement in the reproduction that you're seeing within the yak population. Another thing that we want to do is, once we get a calf on the ground, we want to avoid sickness as much as possible, and we want to certainly avoid death after birth prior to being able to market those animals. And so these are all factors that I think are subcategories of optimizing efficiency, but certainly have a lot of importance. And for this operation, they're wanting to sell meat, and so having a desirable meat product might be another breeding objective. So the second one, everything's pretty much the same down to here, but for this beef producer that may be more on the fiber side of things, their product that they're trying to market would want to be large and high quality of the fiber that they're trying to produce. So like I say, a lot of breeding objectives tend to be similar across operations, but then there might be some finer points between one or another. So what genetic tools do we have available to us, to you guys currently? The first is going to be outcrossing. Now, within the cattle industry, when I give a similar type talk, I talk about crossbreeding. But you guys aren't as developed into breeds like the beef industry is. And so we need to think about it more from an outcrossing standpoint. And I'll go into more detail on both of these to follow up. And the other is through our selection practices. And we'll hit that pretty hard as well, as to what tools you have and how you can do it now, and even hopefully think futuristically about what can be in the future. So outcrossing, how we need to think about this is that we need to be thinking about breeding lines that are less related to each other. And that's basically what an outcross is. And so it's really the avoidance of inbreeding, if you want to think of it that way. And so the reason that we do this is the biggest impact that we get is, let me see if I can figure out my pointer, Jeff. Tell me if this works. Is that working as a pointer? Can you see it, or is it?
It can. It's real small.
Okay. I'm assuming there's probably a way to make it bigger. Ooh, there we go. How about that? That
there
better?
You go. That's
all
better.
Right. So the biggest impact that we get from avoiding inbreeding or having a good outcrossing program is through improved reproduction and longevity, which I think everybody will agree from an economic standpoint are probably two of the most important things we can do. If we can get a calf from our females every year or most years, and that those females stay in our herd a long period of time, continually give us a calf, that is the most efficient usage of that animal. Where we get the least impact from minimizing our inbreeding or optimizing our outcrossing are through the highly heritable traits. And I'm going to go through heritability in a little bit and show you those. But for the most part, when we talk about highly heritable traits, it's usually traits like the meat characteristics, larger loin eyes and things like that. Those are our more highly heritable traits. And then the tools that we have to help us with our outcrossing, genomics, and I'm going to go through some of the things that Ted has been doing for you guys on the genomic side of things, and that in combination with some of the matching software that's being developed. Those are great tools for assisting you with their outcrossing. And another big one that I know Jeff has been working with, and I know that there's a lot of work that you guys have been doing, is trying to get to where you can freeze semen and transport semen and have a more active AI program. And if you get to that point, that is going to greatly assist with your ability to outcross. So jumping into what you guys have now from a genomic standpoint and what's available to you, and I know that most of you have probably been on and are familiar with what's going on here, but and I just wanted to go through it just a little bit. I'm not going to go into great detail, but just kind of show you some of the what's there and how it can be used to help you with avoiding the inbreeding. Now, one aspect of that is to look at the actual inbreeding coefficients that are being calculated. And so the estimate of the inbreeding coefficient you can see here for this animal is 0.14. Here's what you need to understand, and this is where outcrossing becomes important, because what a lot of people don't understand is when you have inbreeding is when you make two animals together that are closely related, you get more homozygosity. Okay, if you want to practice the best outcrossing, don't look for two animals to mate that might necessarily have very small inbreeding coefficients and think that by mating them together, you're going to get less inbreeding. That's not how it works. And actually, if you have two lines that are highly inbred, so you could have a bull and a female that are highly inbred, but from different lines. And so they actually have fixed or are homozygous at different traits or alleles or markers within the genome, then when you cross those two highly inbred lines, you get an expansion or a great outcrossing as a result. Okay, so a greater level of heterozygosity. So you're not necessarily looking for two lowly inbred or too low coefficient of inbreeding animals to mate together. But you need to think about how to match them up properly, okay? Because if you breed two highly inbred lines and they're related, then you are going to get an even more inbred animal as a result. So I just want to go through a couple, and this is some of the information that you guys can get off of the website. So we have these two different animals. This is a potential sire that's being looked at, and here's a potential dam. All right, and so if you look at it, let's look at the fourth marker that has been identified, and we can see what the genotype there is CC, okay? Then on the dam that we might be considering to breed to at that marker 4, it's a homozygous as well, but it's homozygous for the TT, okay? And so if we think about it, if you cross those two animals, there's 100% chance that it's going to be a CT, the calf, at that fourth marker. And sure enough, if we look at the calf produced by these two animals, that's exactly what we got, exactly what we would expect, okay? But let's take a look at a different slide. Let's look at marker 6, where we have an AT, and the cow that we're considering breeding to is a GT, okay? So we have one, and that's not right to call these alleles, but let's call it that for simplicity's sake. But so for this particular situation now, that A could combine with the G, okay? And there's a 25% chance that that would happen. The A from the sire could combine with the T, and there's a 25% of that. The T from the sire could combine with the G, 25% chance, or the T could combine with the T and give us a homozygous, and there's a 25% chance of that as well. And so the reason all of this is important is depending on what the sire's genotype is and the dams are, you can look at all the different markers and figure out if they get mated, what the probability of the heterozygote makeup is going to be from the offspring. Okay, and so that's the matching software that I mentioned that's being developed. That's in a very basic way of explaining kind of what that software can do is to help match up a sire and a dam that are going to give you a higher percentage of heterozygotes, which is what you're looking for. That's what an outcross, a good outcross is going to give you a higher percentage of those heterozygotes. Okay, and so for this particular situation, you can see the one that actually hit was the 25% that the T matched with the T. So we actually, even though there was a greater chance that we would get a heterozygote for that marker, we actually got a homozygote for that marker. And that certainly can happen. We would, like I say, we would expect it 1 out of 4 times to happen that way. So I can't stress enough, because as I mentioned, that some of this software that's being developed and that information that's being provided to you guys through the genomics is an extremely valuable tool to help you to match up those sires and dams that are going to give you the greatest possibility for those heterozygotes or those outcrosses. So, and because of the great impact that that's going to help you with reproduction, because the issues that you guys tend to have, it looks to me like, is extremely variable age at puberty, but later than we would like for it to be. We would really, I think, like to see, based on what I saw from the variability, if you could strive to get females bred as 2-year-olds or to calve as 2-year-olds, that needs to be the goal. And something that's going to help you to do that is the less inbreeding you can get, the better your odds are, because inbreeding does lead to later puberty and is going to push more of you to have to calve as 3-year-olds for the first time, which cuts back on your lifetime efficiency of that cow. And just reproduction rate in general, even on older females, is going to be much improved through a good outcrossing program. All right, so switching over to the selection side of things, just deciding which animals are going to produce the next generation. So there's a lot of traits that you guys have that can be considered. Certainly, calving ease would be one that's like I said, probably at least needs to be done initially to help monitor and not get yourself in trouble. If you're in if you're trying to sell from a production standpoint, then pounds are certainly going to be an important trait to think about. Milk from 2 ways. If you're basically trying to produce heavier animals to enter the market from a meat standpoint, then the mother's milk is going to help get you to that point. Or if you're in the milking of the yaks, that's going to help you as well to know the level of milk that you can get out of those females. The fiber traits, for those of you that's important. Reproduction, as you're going to see in a little bit, it's a lowly heritable trait. So our rate of progress is fairly slow for reproductive traits, but it's still something that I think, because of the economic importance of reproduction, that needs to be a consideration as well. Certainly the meat traits for those of you that are trying to produce those high quality meats to sell to folks. Disease resistance, once again, that's trying to cut back on that morbidity and mortality in the early ages of the calves. There are some genetic components there as well. It's much less understood, but the more we understand, we actually used to think it was extremely lowly heritable. Most of the information on cattle anyway is indicating that it's a little bit closer to more moderately heritable in terms of some of the disease resistance. If we can get a good technique of actually describing it so that we can keep better records on health, we could do a much better job with our selection. So that's one area you guys could take advantage of in the early stages is trying to get good information on health records to help in the future with some selection for disease resistance. Color and pattern traits, those are important to a lot of yak producers as I look through and have read up on a lot of the information. And Dr. Limcooler was telling me that some of the breeders are actually very interested in horn size and shapes and things like that, which certainly has a genetic component as well. So when we think about traits, they fall into two basic categories. We have what we call qualitative traits, and those are kind of the easy ones. They're usually controlled by one pair of genes with limited impact from the environment. And I'll go over some examples of each in a little bit. And then the other group are the quantitative traits, and these are usually controlled by many genes, and the environment plays a big role on these traits. So qualitative traits, usually these are the traits that we call that are controlled by what we call simple inheritance, okay? And so a couple that really impact us are what we call additive gene actions. And this is where the genotype can usually be determined from the phenotype. And once again, I'll go over an example here in a second. The other type of or gene action is dominance, and this is where we typically need a genetic test to help us identify the heterozygotes from our homozygotes for that trait. So a couple of examples are coat color and nose color in the yaks, okay? So for the additive type trait, coat color within yaks is an additive trait, where how we describe that or depict that from a genotypic standpoint, if they're homozygous for solid, they're always going to be solid. Of course, if they're homozygous for royal, then, and that's depicted by the small c's, then when you have two small c alleles, then you're always going to get a royal coat color. But when you cross the two of these and get a heterozygote, then what the result is the trim. And so as you can tell by looking at what the coat color is, you can easily detect which is which from the genotype that animal is going to have. Whereas with nose color, which is the gene action there is dominance, you have the imperial and then you have the native, okay? And so the reason it becomes tougher is now because both the homozygous for the imperial or the heterozygote, both from a phenotypic standpoint, are imperial. Okay, so that's the phenotype or what you actually see. Whereas the only time you see a native nose color is when you have the homozygous for the recessive allele, which is the native allele. Okay. And so the only way that we know by looking at an imperial animal, whether it's a carrier of the native allele or not, is through genomics testing to see if it is a carrier or not. And so from what I read, you guys don't have an issue with things like lethal recessives, now, which we've had some real issues with in the beef industry. If you guys were to develop, and you can't help it because those happen through mutations, but if something were to show up, a lethal within the population, then what we call a lethal recessive, then really the only way to know the animals that are carriers is by doing a genomics test on them to find those carriers to help manage you through that process to avoid the problem of having 25% of a calf crop potentially dying because of the lethal recessive. Okay. And so it's not an issue for you currently, but nature could cause it to be an issue for you in the future. So for quantitative traits, it gets a little more complicated because, like I said, this is where we have a lot of genes that are involved in the trait, and the environment plays a large role in these traits as well. Traits like our weight traits, those are quantitative traits. Muscling, thickness of muscling, the ability to fatten, all of these traits are controlled by multiple genes and are what we call quantitative traits. If you're ever going to get a good grip on quantitative traits and try and make improvements through selection, you're going to have to keep records. And I am just like most everybody else. Record keeping is not my favorite thing to do. But if you want to have a good breeding program, it is absolutely critical. We have to keep records, and we have to be able to compare those records. And what I mean by that is, in the beef side of things, this is an example. We have to, for weaning weights, we always adjust them to 205 days. I don't know what that level would be for yaks, and that's something that you guys would probably need to decide on, or if it's not decided already, what a standard, and really it needs to be what's the closest to how the industry operates. At about what age do most people wean their calves? Then you could develop an adjustment for weaning weight, just like the beef cattle have. And so for beef, how we do it, and it would be very similar, is just you take the weaning weight of the animal that when you weigh it at weaning time, subtract off its birth weight. If you didn't collect a birth weight, you could use a standard value there. For beef, they use a 70-pound value there if they don't know what it is. Divide by the age. This gives us our weight per day of age. We can multiply that by that gives us our average daily gain for that animal at around weaning time. Multiply that by the 205 days, and then add back on the birth weight, and whether we used actual or the standard birth weight, that gives us our initial adjusted value. Now, we also have to, if we want to truly compare all of them equally, we have a sex adjustment, and we also have an age of dam adjustment, because I'm assuming with yaks it's going to be very similar to cattle, that a 2-year-old does not milk as well as a 3-year-old, which does not milk as well as a 4-year-old. And for cattle, they reach their optimum milk output at 5 years of age. And then we see a level from a 5-year to a 10-year of age in cattle. And then we start seeing decreases in their ability to output milk after 10 years of age. And so data is going to help you to determine these adjustments here. So this is something that you guys could develop as an association or as a group, what you think should be the standard adjustment age should be. And then based on data, it's fairly easy then to come up with what these sex adjustments should be and what these age of dam adjustments should be. So, but once again, it's easy, but it does take the work of collecting that data so that you can get accurate figures there. So, must be comparable. It must be a heritable trait. If we're going to make any kind of change, then it needs to be a heritable trait. And so, and I'll, once again, like I said, I'll tell you more about heritability, or we'll talk about the different traits and their heritabilities here in just a little bit. Initially, what you're going to do with your selection for quantitative traits is going to have to be based on phenotypes and ratios. This is not the best, and I'll explain why, but you can't just jump straight into breeding values. We have to go through a growing process, and we have to get a lot of records collected before we can get to that standpoint. So how ratios work, they're pretty simple too. Most anyone can calculate a ratio. But once again, it needs to be based on an adjusted weight. And so we'll use the same example like from cattle. So you simply take the adjusted weaning weight or whatever trait you're talking about of each individual. You divide it by the adjusted weaning weight of the contemporary group. Now, the contemporary group are all the calves that were raised in the exact same condition. Okay. They were all in the same pasture, fed the same, treated basically the same. Okay. And so you take the adjusted weaning weight of the individual, divide it by the adjusted weaning weight of that group, multiply by 100. And so as you probably can pick out, 100 is going to be average. If a bull is, say, 115, that means he's 15% heavier than the group that he was raised with for that particular trait. Okay. So problems, like I said, at this point, this is your best option to utilize to make some gains within the breed. But we have to be careful because with ratios, you really can't compare animals across contemporary groups. And I'll show you, my next slide is going to illustrate that hopefully quite well for you. But an animal that's raised on one farm that ratios at 115, you can't say that he's necessarily better than a bull raised on another farm that only ratioed at a 90. Okay. You can't compare animals of different ages even within the same herd. Okay, so if you have a fall calving and a spring calving, you really can't compare the ratios of the calves produced out of those two different contemporary groups. And unfortunately, and at least on the beef side of things, probably doesn't happen on the yak side of things, but within the beef industry, it has been known that producers have manipulated these values before to their benefit, trying to sell bulls. And so it's fairly easily done, certainly not a good trait to have for a breeder, but we do see it happen. All right, and now Jeff told me my image was way too gory, but I figured some of you were going to start dozing off by now, so I wanted to bring you back to life a little bit. So let's talk about heart surgery. So if you were told, and see, I'm starting to get to that age where I have to start thinking about things like this. So if you were told that you were going to have open heart surgery, which would you choose? You have a couple of options here. First option is you have a surgeon, and he came from a class where he ratioed 110. Now, he ratioed 110 out of the Acme Heart School class. And the other guy that you're choosing from, he only ratioed a 90, but he happened to graduate from Harvard Medical School. So if you're having to make that decision, when the beef industry was relying on ratios, I can tell you I heard producers say all the time, I would never buy a bull below a ratio of 100 because that means he's below average. But a below average bull in an extremely good herd might still be a very good genetic bull. Okay. And just because a bull ratioed high, if he was from a very poor genetic base, it still doesn't mean that that's a good bull. So like I said, it helps us to make within herd selections pretty good. Trying to make a cross herd selections, it's not ideal by any stretch of the imagination. So my last point for quantitative traits is what you guys need to strive for, and that is to try and get to the point where you have enough data where you can compute breeding values. And I can tell you that there's three components of actually getting computed breeding values, and these are what we call in the beef industry EPDs. But the three things are pedigree information, which you guys already have, genomics information, which you guys are already doing a great job with, and the other is tons and tons of phenotypic data. And that's probably where you need to make sure that you get to the point of collecting enough data to help you out with computing these, to get to the point of being able to get breeding values, because it ups the game so much in your ability to make good selection decisions. And so how EPDs are going to work in the future, these two bull yaks that you see, one of them has an EPD for, let's say, weaning weight of 25 pounds. And how we do this is pounds of offspring. Okay, so this bull's EPD for weaning weight is 25 pounds. This bull's EPD for weaning weight is 15 pounds. So what these values tell us is if we were to breed these two bulls to equal cows under equal environmental conditions and raise the calves to weaning time, we would expect the calves produced by the bull on the left to weigh 10 more pounds on average than the calves produced by the bull on the right. Okay, so they're very easy to use. Just the difference in the two EPDs for whatever trait we're dealing with is the average difference we would expect to see in those two sires for that trait. For something like calving ease, how we do that in the beef industry is higher values means that you're going to have fewer percentage of pulled calves by that sire as compared to the other sire. So once you can get to this point, it's a fantastic tool and is extremely good for making selection decisions, but it's going to take a lot of work to get to the point to where you're going to be able to get EPDs computed. I want to go through now and just talk about for quantitative traits, how you can manipulate how fast you can make progress. And that's what we call genetic change. So how fast can we make genetic change? And the components that we have are intensity of selection, that's the I, the heritability for the trait that we're interested in, and the generation interval that's in the denominator. Okay, so we'll go through each of those. Now, what the information I'm going to show you is based on is that all the traits that we deal with within most any livestock species follows a bell-shaped curve to where most of the animals are right here in the middle and they perform on average. And you have a very small percentage of the population that way outperforms the average of the population, but you have about an equal number of animals over here on the left side that underperform compared to the entire population. Okay, and so this is what we call genetic diversity, and genetic diversity is what allows us to make genetic improvement. Okay. So think about it like we did in the beef industry, where a few years back in the 80s, we went way to the extreme of having cattle get very, very tall and really went overboard on it. And that was because earlier in the 50s and 60s, we kind of went overboard in the other direction. We had very, very small animals. But where we probably needed to be was kind of somewhere in the middle. And that's my favorite picture because that cute guy with the cowboy hat is me in 1972 with the Grand Champion steer. So I was a happy camper at that time. So let's talk about the components. Intensity of selection. So what is intensity of selection? If we look at that bell-shaped curve and the population of the animals that you have, if you collected weights, let's say weaning weight or whatever trait we want to talk about, and you think that your herd is probably going to show up similar to a bell-shaped curve if you plotted those animals on a graph. And let's say that you decided to choose the top 15%. So what's in the shaded area, all those animals that are in there that had really high weaning weights, those are the ones that you chose to keep back as breeding stock. You had a choice that you could move that line to the right and only keep back 10% of the top animals. And if you do, that increases your intensity of selection. So how they actually get it is you subtract the average of the group that you selected from the average of the population as a whole, and that's where you get your intensity of selection. So the further you move your selection line to the right, the greater your intensity of selection is, and the faster your genetic change happens. Because remember, intensity is in the numerator side, so bigger numbers means faster change. So some ways that you can do that: breed bulls and cows with superior values for the trait you're trying to improve. I know that sounds very simple, and it is, but simply selecting back the higher group of high performing bulls and females and mating them together is how you're going to make those improvements. And you can't do that without records. You need to retain your superior heifers and try and replace back the inferior cows. So every year you need to be going, and this is hard to do when you're on a building program process and within a population. And Jeff and I talked about this, and I know the yak breeders as a whole are in an expansion mode right now. And this becomes harder when you're in expansion mode. It's easy to keep back females, but sometimes we don't just keep back the superior heifers. We keep back some of those that aren't quite as good either. And the same thing, we tend to keep around our cows, even the inferior ones, when we're trying to build numbers in our population. But just realize that you're doing that at the expense of genetic progress. It slows genetic progress. And here's the big one: if you can get to the point where you can use some outside bulls and find better genetics outside of your herd and bring that in, and that's what AI is going to be able to do for you, that's going to greatly improve that your intensity of selection as well. Heritability, to be honest, you can't do much about that because the traits have their heritability already. But it can tell you how fast you can expect change to happen. So a trait like reproduction, it's lowly heritable, so the rate of change is going to be slow for those traits. Health and weight gain traits, moderately heritable, so our progress is going to be moderately fast. For things like fiber and the end product, those are highly heritable traits, and so you can make a lot of progress really fast with those types of traits. And so knowing the heritability will at least tell you your expected rate of progress. And the last thing is generation interval. Before I go on, I want to take a step real quick. You see this equation looks a little bit different than what we had before. This is what you're going to be able to get to once you get to breeding values, is you're going to be able to break it out one step further. And instead of looking at heritability, you're just going to be looking at additive genetic invariance. And here's where accuracy is going to come important. And I want to point that out because it leads us to an important thing that we just got implemented in the past 15 years or so on the beef side of things. Is vast improvements to our accuracy of our EPDs. How we do that is a lot of different ways, but what I'm going to focus on is this genomics side of things, because you guys are way ahead of the game already there. You already have a good genomics program in place, and it's going to benefit you even better in the future. And I'm going to show you an example of why. This is me and my 4 brothers quite a few years ago. And I want to use us as an example for showing you why genomics can be so important in a genetic evaluation program. The biggest thing is it, and you guys are already doing this part of it, it gives you accurate parentage. You'd be amazed at how often people get that wrong. Bulls jump the fence, I guess, or all kind of things can happen. But accurate parentage is an important part of a good genetic evaluation program, and you've already got that part already in place. But the other part is it improves our understanding of relationships, and I'll show you an example of that here in just a second. But the first is accurate parentage. I don't know if any of you guys have done it, but me and several of my brothers and my dad and actually my son have all done the human genome testing deal. And I want to show you this next slide, but where this comes into place is if you guys are going to do it, I encourage you. It is fun to do, but you better either have a lot of faith in folks or be ready for some surprises sometimes. And that's the same thing in the yak side of things. I bet you found out that the parents that you thought were a calf's parents might not come out to be. But when I first got this back, if you've never done it, what you do is you basically spit in a test tube, send it to these folks. You don't tell them who your parents or your kids or anything are, they send back a sheet of paper and they tell you who you're related to. So I didn't think about that until I pulled up this screen on the computer. And the first thing that I noticed when I did was that this guy was my dad. And fortunately, that's who I had always thought was my dad. But the next thing I got scared about was, okay, well, what about my son who had been tested? And fortunately, that turned out to be the case as well. So if you're going to do it, just be prepared. But this is kind of the neat slide that I wanted to show you, because there is genetic variation that doesn't happen like we expect it to. And that's where it becomes important for genetic evaluations. If you'll look at chromosome 12, you can see that my son got half of his genetics, the orange part, from me. But the blue part is the genetics that he got from my dad. And he got the whole chromosome worth of genetics from my dad. So for chromosome 12, he got no genetic information from my mom. Okay. So you would expect a grandparent to contribute 25% of the total, but that is only an estimate. You get half of your genetics from each parent, but grandparents, even though we expect it to be 25%, might not turn up that way. Because look at, as the other example, chromosomes 4 and 5, you can see that my son got no DNA from my dad. So he got the full chromosome worth of DNA from my mom for those two. And where that becomes important is an example from Angus that I'm going to show you. They looked at 6 full sibs. Okay, so those bulls had the same mother and father. We would expect the relationship to be 0.5, right? If you have full sibs, you expect them to have 50% of their genes in common. These bulls were slightly inbred and they had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.59. So we would therefore expect them to have about 59% of their genes in common. But when they looked at the different pairs of those brothers, the 2 brothers that were the least related were actually under 50% related, or genes in common. And the 2 bulls that were the highest related of that group of full sibs was actually 65% related. And so knowing this helps us to make a more accurate EPD prediction. And so it matters so much. If you look at a breed like Angus for calving yeast, instead of waiting until a bull, you get as much information from a genomic test as if that bull were to have had 24 progeny that you had birth weights on. So instead of waiting for that bull to have 24 calves, you can take that hair sample at birth and get the same amount of information. And so this is what you would strive to do. But I'm telling you, folks, I brought this up and I explained this part because to get to the benefit of having this much data, it requires you to collect a lot of records to get to that point that you're going to be able to get this type of information. It's not undoable. It's very doable. But I encourage you to get started on getting as much data collected as possible. The last part of the genetic change is going to be this part on generation interval. I'm going to kind of skip over that part because once again, it's kind of like with when we were talking about the intensity of selection, because they're related. It depends on how far you go. So to lower your generation interval, you want to keep back a higher percentage of heifers because that's going to give you a younger herd. But what's that do for intensity of selection? It decreases it. So to increase your intensity of selection, what you in effect do is inadvertently raise your generation interval. And so it's one of those things that you kind of have to understand that it's probably more important to increase that selection interval, or the intensity of selection, as opposed to trying to greatly manipulate that generation interval. You can use selection to increase a trait, decrease a trait, or what we don't ever think about is sometimes we need to leave them the same. And you can use selection to do that as well. So when you make selection decisions, I'm wrapping up here, Jeff. We want to consider our marketing options. You need to consider management and the environment that you're going to be putting the animals in. You need to decide what's economically important to you. And that can be both things that can put money in your pocket, but you also need to think about traits, things like how much feed intake they have, something that can take money out of your pocket. And then you need to consider the tools that you have available to help you make those selection decisions. Not going to go into this. I just want to tell you, you can't just focus on one trait at a time. You need to always think about multiple trait selection so that you don't get in trouble with improving one trait and inadvertently hurting other traits. So take home messages. We need your breeding scheme needs to be specific to your operation, the goals that you have, the improvements that you want to make, and try and fit the market that you're trying to sell your product into. Need to take advantage of the tools that you have. For you guys, that's going to be outcrossing and currently selection with phenotypes and basically ratios and phenotypes, but hopefully in the future with a genetic evaluation based on breeding values. And last but not least, and the big message of tonight is to do all of this, records are important. It's important to make those phenotypic selections today. It's important to make those relationships between your genomics and the traits that they can impact. And it's going to be ultimately important to get those breeding values that you need to be striving for. And I am going to wrap that up. And Jeff, be happy to try and answer any questions that anybody has.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Bullock. That was good overview of genetics and selection and how to make use of the tools that are out there. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. We'll try to moderate things as we go. Sandra, go ahead.
Yes. So I've raised beef cattle all my life, and I rely heavily on the EPDs for the beef and selection, breeding, all of that. And it's, I've just found it to be extremely valuable. And of course, over the years, it's become, more and more accurate. I guess in terms of the Yaks, and I know this really depends upon how many people participate, but, how long will it take to get, fairly accurate EPDs on Yaks?
Well, to be quite honest, it's going to depend on you guys. The faster you can get a lot of data in, because like I said, you've already got the structure. The structure are the pedigrees, and then in combination with the phenotypes. And then that's the first piece of the puzzle. You can start getting a breeding value based on those two pieces of information. What's going to take a greater level of information is to find those good relationships between those SNPs that you guys have already identified, those, the variations that you have in the SNPs and their relationship to the quantitative traits. Because on a quantitative trait, what we found is instead of there being a few very major genes for something like weaning weight, there's a whole bunch of very small influence of genes throughout the genome that actually influence weaning weight. And so in order to be able to precisely figure out the contribution of each of those SNPs to something like weaning weight, it takes a lot of data. And so that is going to take a little bit longer time to find those really good relationships so that we can use the genetic markers in the genetic evaluation. But the other side can happen just as fast as you guys start producing the data to go in with the pedigree to get genetic evaluations.
So I guess the other part of that is who's collecting the data.
That's not something I can answer, but that is something that you guys need to certainly think about and is important. I mean, of course, on the beef cattle side, that's done through each individual breed association. And it is probably the worst model in the world you could think about to try and do something, because each breed association has their own rules, their own way of doing things, and they all do it basically right and similar in the way they do it, but it's tons of duplication and it's tons of confusion because they don't always call the traits the same thing and all that. And I understand there's some different yak associations. I would encourage you guys, you're already a fairly small group of breeders to start with. If there was any way you guys could come to some understanding to at least your end goals might be different. And I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to wade in here. But ultimately, you would all benefit from a cumulative database to where you could get to these genetic evaluations faster, and then use them how you want to promote what it is you're trying to do with your association. But if you could somehow consolidate the staff that it takes to do these logistics and have the cumulative data, I think it's going to benefit all for the greater good of all. That's my soapbox tonight.
Very good. Dr. Bullock, there was a question from Shakur. How can we improve the genetic or make genetic improvements for milk production in their region? I believe he's in Pakistan. It's a cold mountainous region, and milk production is much lower than cattle typically. So what could they do, thinking again about milk production, to improve the milk that future cows are going to give?
Right. And so, Shakur, just the same with you guys as anywhere else in the world. The more records and data that you have, the better off you're going to be able to do that. Now, in beef cattle, we do that differently than say, the dairy side of things. Whereas the dairy, the milk that you see in dairy is based on the pounds of milk that is produced, or the amount of milk that is produced. How we get to it, once you get to a genetic evaluation standpoint, now prior to a genetic evaluation, that's the only way to really measure the milk production of an animal, is to milk out the females. Once you can get to the point of having enough data, wean and weight data on the progeny, through a genetic evaluation, we can actually sort out between the component that was the genetics for growth and that contributed to that calf's weaning weight, and the component that was attributed to the maternal ability of its dam to produce that weaning weight. And so futuristically, that's another great reason to strive for breeding a genetic evaluation and getting to those breeding values in EPDs, is because you can sort out the milk component from the growth component and make those selection decisions. So without milking them out and just keep it breeding, once again, identifying which bull's daughters were the heaviest producers and using him to breed more females, it's going to be hard to make a lot of rapid progress in milk produced, unfortunately.
I guess just as a follow-up to that, Dr. Bullock and I just finished up a 2-year study on looking at the relationship of milk EPDs and actual milk production. And one of the things you need to make sure to think about, Shakur, is also the variation in milk components, the protein, the fat, because even in our data, it came back average, very typical to what the book values would tell you, but there was a lot of variability between individual animals in the amount of protein or fat that a cow might put into milk. And so that can have an influence then on the growth rate of that calf that's suckling the milk, or in the dairy industry, they standardize everything. Other questions for Dr. Bullock? I wanted to follow up with Sandra's question, Dr. Bullock, and you probably won't answer this. I know you well enough, but let's talk something about weaning weight. What's the number of records that might be needed? Are you talking 500? Are you talking 5,000?
Well, I'm happy to answer that one, actually, Jeff, because there is no real answer. So it's that age-old answer of, you can do it with a few records, but if you want to get really good breeding values, the more you have, the better you're going to be. So realistically, it depends on the population size, of course, that you're talking about. but if you got to the point where you had 500, 1,000 good records that are well connected. Now, that's the other thing about a genetic evaluation is you need to have, and that's where AI is another critical part for this, because the other aspect of a genetic evaluation is connectivity, what we call connectivity. Now, you can do that as direct connectivity, and how that works, Jeff, is if you have a bull that was used on farm A and was also used on farm B, okay, and then so the same bull. So let's say bull 1 was used on both of those farms. Bull 2 was only used on one of the farms, and bull 3 was used on the other farm. Okay, so bulls 2 and 3 aren't directly comparable, but because you can compare bull 1 with both bull 2 on this farm and bull 1 with bull 3 on the other farm, you can indirectly look at the genetic relationship between bulls 2 and 3. And so, as you can see, AI is going to greatly help out getting that connectivity that you need to do a genetic evaluation. You can also do connectivity up through the pedigree, but the further up you have to go through the pedigree, the less accurate your genetic evaluation is going to be. And so you can do it on a small herd. You can do, on a small number of samples. If it's fairly well connected, I'm assuming it's not going to be in the absence of AI. And so it's probably going to take vastly more than say 500 or 1,000 to get to that point. If it's something that you yak breeders are seriously wanting to pursue and willing to put the blood and sweat and tears into, I've mentioned this before, but John Janot is a friend of mine. He works for Igenity, and I know that he does a lot for some of the smaller breeds, doing genetic evaluations. And I think that John would be probably happy to discuss with you guys, what some of those minimums would be, some of the minimum aspects that it would take to get you to the point you want to be. So that's who I would recommend that you guys talk to start, if you start thinking about going down that road.
So I think prioritizing the traits of importance is a good place to think about starting, and then the ease of which data can be collected. It's great to have all kinds of traits, but if they're hard to measure, nobody's going to be able to measure them and report the data.
Absolutely. But easy enough things, though. The easy enough things is collecting things like breeding data, when they were exposed to the bull, when they calved, if they didn't calve or not. All of those things, because like I said, trying to get a handle on some of these reproductive issues is going to be as important as anything, I think, for breeders. And so those are some relatively easy things to do, and then start thinking about things like taking some weights, like I say, sometime around a standard weaning time, maybe a yearling weight or somewhere close to when you typically would slaughter the animals. That's probably a good end point or time period to be taking weights, and start collecting some of that data.
Scrotal circumference would be another good
one.
Sure
thing. Yep.
And the other thing is that, Ted, you mentioned the other day when we were talking, is it's not, records can be done in any fashion, but at some point in time, we may want to funnel them all into a database. And cow number 47 isn't going to tell us enough. We need to also tie back the pedigree data with that individual animals and its performance data. So don't forget about the importance of being able to keep track of dams and sires as we move forward on data collection.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeff, because you were supposed to remind me when I forgot to say it, but that helped remind me. So good job. Is contemporary group information. when you're taking that data, you need to identify all the animals that were raised under the same conditions. So the entire group of calves that you say that you weigh at weaning time, make sure you identify that this, the ones from this pasture were all treated the same and were contemporary group 1. But this other group of 15 were in contemporary group 2 because they were on a different pasture. And you may think that the pastures look similar and everything else, but the more precise you are with defining those contemporary groups, the better your genetic evaluation is, because things like fescue toxicosis and all, the grass may look the same, but the cattle may not perform the same on those 2 different pastures. So if you put them in the same contemporary group, those that were on the more infected pasture would be at a disadvantage, not because of their genetics, but because of the environment.
Danielle put in, funny thing, she's been entering her preg check data for first year heifers in open cows we purchased while listening. So great,
Good deal,
Danielle. It's good to hear that you're doing records. Any other comments or input? Anything that you want to share with the group?
Yes, I just wanted to comment. I was thinking about the AI. I was fortunate enough to be able to experiment a little bit with AI. And the hard part that I found was that it was really hard to actually see them in heat, in standing heat. And the other part of it was, I think their timing was definitely off compared to the beef cattle. Because I just had a very small group, but the ones that I bred is immediately, as soon as I saw them in standing heat, conceived, and anybody that I waited 3 or 4 hours later did not. And so, but anyway, the point I'm trying to make is hopefully we can experiment, a little bit more with that and try to get that down, because, that's going to help us make, I think, maybe some more rapid genetic improvements. But then the other part of it is we've got to make sure we use bulls that are going to improve things and not just any bull because he's pretty, right? Because I do recall that back in the, the 80s and the 90s, we're trying to moderate the beef down from, all these great big, huge animals. And unfortunately, people, a lot of the bulls that were out there were just nice looking bulls, right? And then it created a whole host of other problems, temperament problems, milking problems or feet problems or whatever it might be. And so anyway, I guess that's just my word of caution. AI is great, and I hope that we can really improve it. I think it'll be a great help, particularly for, small breeders that don't want to keep a bull, or, just rapid improvement of traits. But we also have to be careful about who we are actually, breeding our cows to, because it's really, I'll put it this way, you can mess up a whole calf crop by using one bull that's a bad bull. So anyway, it's my soapbox.
Bob, did you want to say something?
No, I didn't have anything to say. I just think that most of the emphasis here is basically for the meat industry to get, weaning weight, and then to try to get them up to a certain weight. Is that the main objective?
I think that's what the breeders and the owners have to really flesh out as well, what your breeding objectives are going to be for your own individual herd.
Yeah, I think that it's important to, when you start thinking about what traits to start collecting data on, is to, once again, it's time to not, for any one particular group or another, to be selfish and chase necessarily just the traits that are going to impact them, but think about a broad suite of traits that would benefit multiple facets of the industry. That would be my advice. But think something like reproduction. I mean, I would certainly think that's something, those reproductive traits, regardless of what your, ultimate desires are, those have to be important to most every breeder, I would think. And things like disposition and aspects like that.
Disposition is heritable?
Absolutely. Yes. It's actually moderately heritable. And what we found in the beef industry, it's important. It's important from a couple of factors. One is just your own personal safety and the safety of your loved ones, but it actually has production implications too. The cattle with poor disposition do not do as well, particularly in the feedlot industry for us on the beef side of things, and the carcasses tend not to be as good either. And I was telling Jeff the other day that I've been working with a colleague in Ireland, and Ireland has implemented their disposition. They look at it two different ways. Now, here in the U.S., we just look at it on the calf side of things, and in terms of bad disposition, but they look at it on the cow as well in terms of the cow's mothering ability of the calf. Because a lot of people have speculated here in the US that selecting for extremely calm calves, that it makes females that they keep back too calm when they need to be a little more protective. And so they look at it as two separate traits. They are correlated, but they look at it as two separate traits. And that might, in talking with Jeff and Ted, it sounds like that sometimes you guys may have some issues collecting things like birth weights because some of the mothers can be a bit protective. And so it's one of those traits that you might want to, avoid the extreme on the protection side of things, but you don't want to get them so much that they don't want to, look after their calf either. So that's another thing that would need to be discussed is for temperament. Maybe I would suggest maybe looking at both traits, both of the mother and of the calf, as two separate traits.
Anybody got anything else? We don't need to keep you any longer than need be.
I just haven't found that I went out and got some cows specifically because of their DNA. I went and did DNA tests on cows that I didn't even own. And I went and procured a couple of them that were absolutely wild and crazy. And just because I wanted the DNA. And I have some unbelievably sweet calves out of them.
Yep, I was going to say, Bob, that's even though it is a heritable trait, how we handle them is a huge impact as well. So you can have extremely good genetics for disposition, and if you treat them poorly, they can be as crazy as a bat, and vice versa. You can have cattle that have pretty poor disposition genetics, but as long as you are always calm around them and treat them right, then they tend to be calm and work well in that situation. So that's the thing about most of the quantitative traits that we deal with is, yes, there's a genetic component, but how we treat them and the environment and the nutrition we put into them, all those factors are extremely important too.
That has been studied actually by, don't know, Dare, if you remember, but when Dr. Burris actually set up a little trial where he took some of the calves at the Princeton station and worked them aggressively through the squeeze chute with a hot shot and then actually ran calves through the first time with no catching, just where they would go through the facility, and then monitored behavior every time they came in afterwards. And they remember that experience, and so they are more agitated when they, are worked more aggressively through there. So behavior is also something that's a bit learned by how we handle them, like Dare said, and it often doesn't seem to be irreversible if they get, handled bad. It may go away, but seems like they remember that for a longer period of time than we would think. There was a question that came in from Danielle. She mentioned that it seems to me that bulls tend to pass on disposition from her experience.
And they do, Danielle, but I'm going to argue that the mother, from a genetic standpoint, is going to. I mean, we do know that they get half their genetics from both the sire and the dam, and actually the female probably has a slightly more influence because they're teachers. They're the teacher of the calf, I think that you definitely see trends in bulls, particularly the reason that it probably shows up more that way is a lot of times you'll have the two bulls that you might have used on your calf crop. And one is a calm bull and one's a bit of a crazy bull. And then you might have 10 calves out of each. And so the calves sort of distribute that same way. So it makes it appear that the bull is the one passing it on, because he is, you are seeing that correctly, but you're only seeing an N of say 5 or 10 from each of the bulls and only an N of 1 from each cow. And so it's a little less apparent how the cow is influencing it. But she does, I can promise you, she contributes an equal amount genetically and even a greater amount from her ability to teach her calf.
Well, if you have any other thoughts, feel free to shoot those to us. You can always email me and I'll forward those on to Dr. Bullock, or you can look up Dr. Bullock.
I've got my address up there too.
Yep.
Happy
Excellent.
to help out with anything if you guys have any questions.
As far as the genetic evaluation, or the genetic testing goes, if you got any questions, Ted is on board here too. If anybody needs any clarification on that process, feel free to shout those out. And we may even ask Ted to come on board and give a presentation on kind of where he's moving forward on some of this as well. And kind of, I think Ted, you'd even mentioned that in the future there might be the opportunities to begin thinking about warehousing the data with production data with genetic data to try and warehouse that together.
Yes, sir.
So going once, going twice. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We appreciate you participating. Remember, we've got the program coming up in March where Zach's going to discuss a little bit about judging terminology. If you've not been familiar with that and you're kind of new to the show ring side of things, and please feel free to pass along information to other your colleagues and yak breeders and owners that that will be doing these programs. We'll get it out hopefully on some of the Facebook forums that are out there. And if you want, you can send us an email and we'll get you on the list, and we'll just shoot you an email and let you know when the next programs are coming along as well. With that, again, Dr. Bullock, I want to thank you for your great presentation, and I want to thank all of you for participating tonight. We look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Enjoyed it. Good luck, everybody.